I was bullied at school because my mom was a stripper. Now my former principal is blackmailing me over her old videos. When my classmates first discovered what my mother did for a living, I was only 9 years old and blissfully unaware of the stigma that would follow me for the rest of my childhood. At that age, I knew my mom worked at nights, and I knew she came home with tired eyes and aching feet, but I believed her explanation that she was simply bartending in a rowdy establishment. It seemed straightforward enough, a job where you stayed out late, poured drinks, and made tips. All I knew was that she could afford the rent on our small apartment, managed to keep food on the table, and always found a way to get me the school supplies I needed. She wore baggy sweatshirts in the morning when she dropped me off at school, insisting she was too tired to dress up, and her eyes never quite lost that half-asleep look. I chalked it all up to long hours and assumed every kid's mother came home at dawn like a grumpy cat who needed a nap. I had no reason to suspect otherwise. Then one day, an older boy with slick hair and a mean grin cornered me in the hallway and asked if my mom was the star dancer at a local club. At first, I had no idea what he was talking about. I insisted he must have confused me with someone else because my mother was a bartender. But he just chuckled, shook his head, and said something along the lines of, "You'll learn soon enough, sweetheart." A few days later, there were whispers and stares. A rumor circulated that my mom was stripping, that some local boys had seen her at a club, that she had a stage name, and that she danced for tips in skimpy outfits. Kids are relentless when they latch onto something like that. They taunted me with winks and lewd jokes I didn't fully comprehend. By the time I got home and tearfully demanded an explanation from my mother, she looked at me with a heartbreak so profound that any anger I had evaporated on the spot. She confessed that she was indeed a stripper at a local gentleman's club. She told me she hadn't meant to hide it forever, but she was trying to protect me from the judgment she knew would come. When my father left us years earlier with scarcely a goodbye, she struggled to make ends meet through multiple part-time jobs, waitressing, or cleaning offices at midnight. Eventually, a friend told her about the money dancers could make. It wasn't glamorous, she said, but it paid far more than waitressing, and it saved us from eviction. My mother cried as she told me how she'd felt backed into a corner, how she hated the work some nights, but also recognized it as a saving grace that let her afford groceries and rent. I was too young to argue with her about morality or respectability, so all I could do was hug her and say I understood. But the next day, I walked into school petrified of how my classmates might use this new ammunition against me. For a few years, the teasing remained intermittent. It flared up whenever a new rumor circulated. Maybe somebody saw her leaving the club. Maybe someone's older cousin recognized her. Maybe a dad attended a bachelor party and thought he spotted her dancing. The stories were never consistent, but they always centered around one humiliating fact. My mother took her clothes off for money. By middle school, my peers had discovered the internet in earnest. And though they never found actual footage of her online, they were experts at inventing elaborate fantasies about her. When I walked by in the cafeteria, I'd hear them laugh and say, "That's the stripper's kid," or, "Hey, does she give your mom's dances for free?" Over time, the shame wormed its way into my head until I believed something must be wrong with me for being born to a woman who would make her living that way. My grades suffered as my focus shifted from schoolwork to self-preservation. If I could avoid the kids who harassed me, if I could switch hallways fast enough, maybe I wouldn't see the drawings they left taped to my locker. Crude sketches of a faceless woman on a pole with a sticky note that read, "Your mom?" Some days I found the bravery to yank them down and tear them to pieces. Other days I felt too tired, too beaten, and I just let them hang there, letting the day pass as if ignoring the problem might make it disappear. Whenever I told my mom, she'd frown and offer to call the principal, but I begged her not to. The last thing I wanted was a bigger spotlight on me. Administrators rarely helped anyway. Even at that age, I sensed they'd blame me for causing a disruption rather than hold the bullies accountable. By 9th grade, the bullying had escalated to a level where I was terrified of walking into school each morning. The atmosphere of the hallways felt predatory, as if the entire student body had collectively agreed that mocking me was an acceptable pastime. A few older students took to trailing behind me, mimicking the movements of a stripper on a pole, cackling loudly whenever they saw me clutch my backpack tighter and speed up. I tried changing my hair, my clothes, my routines. Sometimes I'd show up extra early to hide in the library until first bell. Other times I'd arrive exactly on time so I could blend into the throngs of students and slip unnoticed to my locker. None of it truly worked. Rumors about my mom had spread so far nobody ever let me forget it. That year, the new principal arrived. His name was Todd Nichols, though everyone just called him Mr. Nichols. He had this slicked-back hairstyle and a stern expression, the sort of man who radiated the vibe of I'm in charge and I don't like nonsense. On my first encounter with him, I was curled up in a corner outside the cafeteria after someone dumped a carton of milk onto my shoes while chanting, "Milk for the stripper's baby." Tears were building in my eyes, and I didn't want to cry in front of a crowd. Nichols spotted me, came over, and asked what happened. I half expected him to be kind. Instead, he sighed as though this were an annoyance and told me, "Stop lingering in the hallways. If you see trouble, you should report it, not just stand there." Then he gestured for me to go get cleaned up and walked away without pressing the issue. It was a brusque encounter that left me feeling colder and more alone than ever. I realized then that the administration, including Nichols, might not be on my side. In 10th grade, I mustered the courage to join a club or two, hoping to at least expand my friend group and spend time with people who didn't judge me for my mother's profession. I tried out for the drama club, got a small part in the spring play, and for a fleeting moment, I felt like a normal teenager. But word spread among the cast about who I was, and soon enough, I caught them whispering that my mother was that dancer from the club where my uncle had his birthday. The support I thought I'd found evaporated. One of my fellow cast members even tried to ask me if my mom could perform at our cast party as a joke. When I refused to respond, he smirked, "Just checking, never hurts to ask, right?" There were laughter and snickers. That day, I quit drama club. Mom sensed how miserable I was. She tried to find a different job, waitressing at a mid-range restaurant for a couple of weeks, a receptionist gig for a small travel agency. None paid well enough to cover our bills. Each time she left the club, we'd fall behind on rent. My father contributed nothing. No child support, no phone calls, no presents at all, so it was all on her. I watched her wrestle with guilt, telling me over and over how she wanted to protect me from the cruelty, but we needed the money. I was torn between pride in her resilience and a gnawing resentment that her job had made me into the school's punching bag. Sometimes I snapped at her. Other times I cried that it wasn't fair. She'd hold me and say she understood. But in the end, the routine continued. When I was halfway through 11th grade, my mother finally quit dancing for good. She'd saved enough to pay off the most urgent debts, and a friend helped her land a better paying position at a call center for a medical insurance company. It was boring, she said, but it meant she could be home at nights and wouldn't have to rely on tips from strangers who ogled her body. I breathed a sigh of relief, thinking that maybe the worst was behind us. Our finances were still shaky, but we were proud that she'd left dancing behind. I hoped word would spread that my mom was out of that environment and the bullying would subside. But at school, once a rumor has legs, it never really goes away. People just find new ways to resurrect it. On one particularly bad day, I found a crumpled piece of paper in my locker with a hand-drawn picture of my mom on a pole, accompanied by vile captions. When I tore it up and threw it away, a girl standing at the next locker smirked and muttered, "Just because she quit doesn't erase her videos. You know the internet never forgets, right?" A chill shot down my spine. That was the first time I considered the possibility that footage of her might exist. My mother had never mentioned videos. I scrolled online in terror when I got home, but never found anything conclusive. Plenty of random strippers were out there, but no face that looked like hers. I allowed myself to think maybe it was just rumors, or maybe the few recorded dances from her club never made their way online. Eventually, I graduated from high school. While I didn't sail through with honors, I spent too much time dodging bullies to focus fully on my studies. I managed to keep my grades decent enough to enroll in the local community college. My mother congratulated me, tears in her eyes, proud that I survived high school at all. I told her it felt like escaping a war zone. When we moved to a smaller apartment closer to the community college, we believed we were leaving those traumas behind. She'd moved on from stripping, I was on to higher education, and we had a chance to breathe. Community college wasn't magical, but it was a step up. Nobody knew me as the stripper's kid. Sure, some local high school alumni lingered around, but with so many students from other districts, the rumor mill was less vicious. I started to build a new life, took part in some clubs, worked part-time at a clothing store, and spent weekends studying. My mother found a slightly better position at a small law firm, not as a paralegal, but as a receptionist who doubled as an administrative assistant. It was stable and came with benefits. We joked that her career had gone from spinning around poles to dealing with cranky lawyers, and all was quiet for a while. One day, a letter arrived from my old high school. It had an official seal and was signed by Principal Todd Nichols himself. He invited me to participate in an alumni success panel to speak to current students about life after graduation, share any insights or lessons, and encourage them to keep working hard. My immediate reaction was disbelief. I was hardly a star alumnus, and my high school experience had been a nightmare. Why would they want me to speak? Then I wondered if it was some misguided attempt by the new administration to show that even difficult cases could find a path forward. My mother said maybe it was a sign of reconciliation, a chance to prove to myself that I'd moved on. I reluctantly agreed to do it, figuring that stepping back into that building wouldn't kill me. Maybe it would even offer a measure of closure. I emailed Nichols's office, they confirmed the date, and I brushed off any lingering anxiety with the hope that it'd be a one-off event. I'd stand on stage, say a few words about community college life, then leave and never look back. On the day of the panel, I arrived to find the auditorium half filled with bored students. A few other alumni sat on folding chairs, someone who joined the military, a girl who became a nurse, another who ran a local business. Each took turns at the microphone. When it was my turn, I spoke about how tough it had been to find motivation in high school, but that community college opened new doors, gave me a fresh start, and made me realize no single environment defines your worth. My words felt hollow, but I got polite applause. Then it was done, and I assumed my role was finished. Just as I was gathering my things to leave, Nichols beckoned me over. He still had that slimy, insincere smile. We walked back to his office, where he told me he wanted to thank me personally for participating. I nodded, polite but wary, eager to get out of the building. That's when his face shifted into a smug look I remembered from years past. He reached into a desk drawer and pulled out a small folder. Inside were several grainy still shots, obviously taken from a video. I recognized my mother's face, frozen in mid-spin on a stripper pole, wearing the expression she probably reserved for nights when she had to play a fantasy for the audience. I stared at them, nausea rolling through my gut, wanting to vomit all over his desk. He dropped them on the desk in front of me and made a quiet, measured threat. If I didn't start paying him a monthly sum, hush money essentially, he'd make sure these images, and possibly the full videos, found their way onto the internet and into the inboxes of my mother's current employers. The worst part was the way he whispered it, as if it was no big deal, as though blackmail were just another tool in his belt. He leaned back in his chair, hands folded, and said, "It'd be unfortunate if your mother's new boss saw something like this, or if your professors did, or your friends. Considering how hard you've tried to leave your past behind, I'm sure you don't want these floating around." For a few moments, I was too stunned to respond. The fatherly figure who was supposed to uphold the school's moral code was actually a twisted opportunist, willing to blackmail me with explicit material of my own mother. My voice came out in a shaky whisper. "Why are you doing this?" And he responded with a bland shrug, some muttered nonsense about how his own finances were strained, how the district didn't pay him enough, and how he thought I owed him a favor because of all the leniency he had shown me during high school. I gaped at him, tears building in my eyes, outraged at the idea that he'd shown me any leniency at all. He basically let me be bullied for 4 years, and now he was twisting the knife by threatening me with something I'd barely escaped in the first place. He set a figure for what he wanted monthly, an absurd amount given that I was a community college student working part-time. Even my mother's receptionist job couldn't cover that without us falling behind on rent again. When I told him we didn't have that kind of money, he gave a condescending smirk and said, "Then you'd better find it. You've got 1 week. After that, I start sending out emails." I stumbled out of his office in a haze, a sick feeling clinging to my ribs like tar. My whole body trembled as I reached my car, and I sat there for who knows how long, fighting the urge to scream or sob or both. That night, I told my mother everything. She stared at me like she was hearing the words but not comprehending them. Then the color drained from her face, and she stood up so suddenly the dining chair crashed behind her. "He has what?" she demanded, and when I repeated it, she let out a string of curses, pacing the living room. The heartbreak in her expression was raw, a testament to how she tried so hard to put that life behind us. "I can't believe he'd sink that low," she hissed. "He's a principal, for God's sake." We talked late into the night, debating whether we should just refuse to pay. My mother, in a burst of rage, said she'd rather see those videos leaked than surrender a dime to him. But we both knew that was easier said than done. If he carried out his threat, her job at the law firm could be in jeopardy. Sure, discrimination against her for a past job might be legally questionable, but in reality, employers often find reasons to let someone go when scandal hits. And for me, the personal humiliation would be immeasurable. The thought of my college classmates and coworkers seeing those videos paralyzed me with dread. Eventually, we decided to see a lawyer. Even if we couldn't afford a fancy one, we needed professional advice. The following day, we found an attorney who specialized in harassment and cybercrime crimes. After hearing our story, she insisted this was textbook blackmail and told us we had legal options. But we needed proof. We only had my word about that conversation, no recordings, no text messages. To build a strong case, we'd have to get him to threaten us again, ideally in a manner we could record or document. My mother and I exchanged nervous glances, realizing that to catch him, we might have to engage with him and risk him leaking something prematurely. We spent days wrestling with the idea of wearing a wire or tricking him into putting his demands in writing. The lawyer recommended trying to persuade him to text or email the details of his extortion. That alone would be enough for the police to act. But we also knew Todd wasn't stupid. He'd likely seen blackmail cases on the news and would avoid leaving a paper trail. Ultimately, we came up with a plan. I'd call him and say we'd gather the money, but needed something in writing to keep track of the amounts. We hoped he'd slip and confirm the scheme via text. My mother hated the plan, but it seemed like our best shot at collecting evidence. A week later, the dreaded day arrived when Todd expected his first payment. I texted him with trembling fingers, "I have the money, but I need you to confirm the amount and drop off details in writing so I can keep it organized." He replied almost instantly, telling me to call him instead. I tried coaxing him into writing it down, repeating that I needed something to show my mother, but he refused. "Call me if you're serious," was all he said. My mom and I cursed under our breath, realizing he wouldn't put himself at risk with a text. The lawyer provided us a small recorder I could keep hidden in my purse. It was legal in our state to record a conversation as long as one party, me, consented. Still, it was nerve-wracking. If he sensed a trap, he might release the material out of spite. But we had to try. I arranged to meet him at a diner near the school, claiming we wanted to hand off the money in person. My mother waited in the car, biting her nails, terrified for me. Inside the diner, Todd sat at a corner booth, sipping coffee. I slid onto the seat across from him, my heart pounding against my ribs. He greeted me with a smug grin and casually asked if I had the cash. I told him I needed more specifics first. How often, how much, how long we'd do this. He leaned forward, voice low, explaining that he wanted a monthly payment for at least a year. If we missed any deadlines, he'd accidentally forward some clips to the law firm or my college. His threats were chillingly precise. My phone recorded every word, though my hand was shaking under the table as I pretended to keep it there for no particular reason. When he finished laying out his extortion plan, I asked if he'd confirm via text. He refused again, saying, "I'm not an idiot." Then he named the sum and the place to drop it off in cash each month. I mumbled assent, though the idea of actually paying him made my stomach turn. He looked oddly triumphant, as if he'd just sealed a business deal. Before leaving, he threw a few bucks on the table for his coffee and walked out, pausing only to remind me I had 1 week to deliver the first payment, or else. My hands trembled as I pressed stop on the recorder. The entire encounter made me feel grimy, as if I'd just compromised my morals in front of the whole world. But that tape was our lifeline. When I hurried back to the car, my mother asked how it went, and I burst into tears of mixed relief and horror. We drove straight to our lawyer's office and handed over the recording. She listened with tense focus, nodding at all the right moments. By the end, she looked us in the eye and said, "This is exactly what we need. We can go to the police with this." The next morning, we filed a report with the local precinct, gave them the recording, and explained our entire ordeal. The detective who took our statements appeared disgusted by Todd's behavior. He told us that blackmail and extortion were serious crimes and that the recording was solid evidence. Of course, Todd would have the right to defend himself, but it was likely enough for an arrest. We left feeling a glimmer of hope. After so many years of being shamed, maybe this time the law would protect us. Soon after, we received word that Todd had been taken in for questioning. The police wouldn't give us all the details, but we sensed movement. My mother and I began to breathe a bit easier, until a few days later, when I started getting calls from a blocked number. Each time, the line was silent, then cut off. By the 5th time, I picked up, and Todd's voice hissed at me through the phone. He said he knew we went to the police, and we had one last chance to drop the charges, or he'd make sure every inch of footage he had would go viral. I was shaking so hard I nearly dropped the phone. He hung up before I could respond. My mother clutched my arm, telling me to stay calm, that we should alert the detective. We did. The detective advised us not to engage, to save the voicemail if there was one, there wasn't, and to consider changing my number if the calls kept coming. He reassured us that Todd had no legal right to contact us, especially if he was out on bail. We hunkered down and waited, praying Todd would be too scared of the legal consequences to actually release the footage. But our luck ran out. Within a week, a few random acquaintances messaged me on social media asking if the stripper in a certain leaked screenshot was my mother. The image was fuzzy, but if you knew her face, there was no mistaking the resemblance. My mother nearly collapsed when she saw it. She recognized the setting, the outfit, the approximate time it was filmed. It was old from her early days at the club. Within hours, gossip spread among some people who remembered her from around town. My mother's boss got wind of it, though he didn't fire her immediately. He called her into a private meeting, asked if it was really her, and then told her he didn't see how her past was relevant to her current job, but he worried about the office's reputation. To his credit, he didn't let her go. Still, she walked out of that meeting shaking with humiliation, convinced half the staff now viewed her as some shameful figure. Through our lawyer, we learned Todd was likely the one who posted the screenshot or gave it to someone who did. That action would only strengthen the case against him, but it didn't erase the humiliation we felt. We lay awake at night, refreshing social media in fear of new leaks, preparing ourselves for the possibility that the entire video might appear somewhere. For me, it felt like reliving high school all over again, except this time the stakes were even higher. My mother's entire livelihood was on the line, not just my mental health. When Todd was formally charged with extortion, harassment, and additional cyber-related crimes, we felt an initial surge of relief. But the legal process is slow, and there was no guarantee he wouldn't post more videos. We lived in a state of suspended anxiety, flinching every time our phones buzzed. The detective encouraged us to hold on, promising that a conviction would come if we stayed the course. Meanwhile, my mother and I took comfort in the fact that we at least had each other. She'd hold me on nights I couldn't stop shaking, whispering, "I'm so sorry," as if it were her fault for ever setting foot on a stripper stage. I'd stroke her hair, telling her we shouldn't blame ourselves. Todd was the criminal, not us. A few weeks after Todd's arrest, the local news picked up the story. High school principal accused of blackmailing former student using explicit videos. An anchor summarized the situation on the evening broadcast, and though they kept my name and my mother's name out of it, plenty of people in town knew who it was. My phone lit up with texts from old classmates who either wanted salacious details or to offer shaky words of support. Some apologized for how they treated me in high school. I read each message with a numb detachment, not sure whether to feel vindicated or just exhausted. Todd made bail at first, but when he violated a no-contact order by trying to phone me again, the court revoked his bail. He ended up stuck behind bars awaiting trial, which gave us some breathing room. In the weeks that followed, my mother's boss grew more sympathetic, especially when we explained how Todd had leaked that image. We realized a silver lining. The more Todd harassed us, the more he proved our case. It didn't change the mortification we felt whenever we imagined how many random strangers might be looking at her screenshot, but at least from a legal standpoint, it was more ammo against him. The trial itself was a surreal experience. My mother and I both testified about the blackmail, the years of bullying I endured, the conversation at the diner that we'd recorded, and the subsequent threats and leaks. Todd's lawyer tried to paint us as opportunists out for revenge, but the audio recording spoke for itself. The jury heard his voice calmly laying out the payment schedule and threatening to leak the videos if we didn't comply. It was sickening to listen to in a formal courtroom, but it was also an undeniable piece of evidence. The prosecutor hammered home how he had used his position of authority to exploit a former student, which seemed to appall the jurors. When the guilty verdict was read, my mother broke into sobs. Todd looked furious, muttering under his breath. The judge sentenced him to a few years in prison plus probation, not an extraordinarily long stretch, but enough to signal that what he did was beyond the pale. After that, we left the courthouse in a daze, both relieved and emotionally drained. The weight of it all washed over us as we drove home. I asked my mom if she felt safe now. She nodded, though I could see the heartbreak in her eyes at how far this had gone. In the months that followed, the leaked screenshot recirculated a few times, but people eventually moved on to other gossip. My mother's law firm stuck by her, which we counted as a huge blessing. She worked there with renewed vigor, determined to prove her worth. Meanwhile, I transferred to a university out of state to continue my degree. A small part of me was running away from the stigma, but a bigger part wanted a true fresh start. I found a modest off-campus apartment and took a job at a local bookstore. No one there knew about my mother or me, and I didn't volunteer the information. It felt like breathing clean air for the first time in a decade. We had occasional nightmares, of course. Sometimes I'd wake up in a sweat, dreaming that Todd released even more explicit videos, or that my entire dorm was laughing at me. My mother talked to a counselor to work through her lingering shame, that gnawing feeling that she'd failed me by choosing such a profession in my childhood. But I kept assuring her that the real villain was Todd, not her. She had done what she had to do to keep us afloat, and no one, especially not a school official, had the right to weaponize that history against us. Over time, I found solace in telling a few close friends at my new university what happened. They reacted with horror and compassion, reminding me that not everyone in the world is quick to judge. My mother progressed at the law firm, slowly but steadily, and even took a few night classes toward becoming a paralegal herself. She said it was her way of taking back control, using the law to protect people the way we wished we'd been protected all those years ago. Sometimes acquaintances from high school would reach out, confessing they saw the news story and wanted to apologize for bullying me back then. I wasn't sure how to feel. Part of me appreciated the apology. Another part of me was too scarred to trust they meant it. In the end, I let go of grudges, telling myself that dwelling on the past only gave Todd's actions more power. I saw it as a chance to close that chapter and focus on building the life I deserved. My mother and I remain close. We speak every day, often about normal things like groceries and weekend plans, but occasionally about deeper wounds. She still apologizes every now and then for putting me through so much. I remind her that she never intended to hurt me and that I respect how tirelessly she worked to keep a roof over our heads. Now that Todd is in prison, we feel a measure of justice. It doesn't erase the humiliations we faced, but it does give us a sense that we stood up to a bully who held all the wrong cards. Even now, there's a small part of me that relives the shock of seeing those stills on Principal Nichols's desk, of hearing him demand hush money as if I were some pawn. The memory makes me angry and sick, but it also fuels my resolve to never again let someone else dictate my worth or hold me hostage with shame. If anything, it proved to me how important it is to stand up for yourself, to seek allies, and to trust that the truth can prevail, even in the face of blackmail. Some nights, I reflect on the entire journey. My mother's struggle as a stripper when I was a child, the relentless bullying throughout school, the final betrayal by the person who should have protected me. I see how it shaped me into someone who refuses to let others define me, who recognizes that a family's survival story is complicated, and that judging someone's past without understanding the context is a cruel oversimplification. I've grown into an adult who fights for my own dignity, and by extension, the dignity of others. There are still moments when I flinch at the word stripper in casual conversation, or when I see a local news story about a scandal. But the flinch is fleeting. I remind myself that I lived through something vicious and survived with my moral compass intact. My mother and I proved that no matter what people say or how they threaten us, we get to define our story. We aren't victims doomed to hide, and we aren't criminals. We're just two people who faced hardship and confronted a predator who tried to exploit it. Sometimes people ask if we've forgiven Todd. That question catches me off guard because forgiveness implies a readiness to release anger. I'm not sure I feel obligated to forgive someone who leveraged my mother's body and my childhood trauma for money. What I do feel is a sense of closure. He's been punished, his career is in tatters. Maybe one day, if he truly realizes the harm he caused, he'll find some measure of redemption on his own path. But that's not my responsibility. My responsibility is to heal. And heal we have. My mother is now married to a kind man who knows her past and respects it as part of her journey. He doesn't judge her. Instead, he admires her resilience. I finished my degree and am looking into graduate programs, possibly in counseling or social work, because I want to help teens who endure the kind of bullying and exploitation I went through. We managed to build a life beyond the shadows of that old strip club and that blackmail scheme. Every day, I remind myself it's not about where you start, but where you're determined to go despite the obstacles. On the rare occasions I come across pictures of us from my high school years, I see a frightened, hunched over version of me who dreaded every sunrise because it meant facing torment at school. I see a harried, exhausted mother who, by day, tried to appear cheerful and supportive, and by night was dancing under stage lights for strangers. And I see a family that refused to shatter under the weight of public scorn. That past is still part of us, but it no longer dictates who we are. The blackmail only reinforced how low some people can sink, but it also showed us how strong we can be when we stand together. I wish no one else had to go through the shame and fear we did. If someone reading this has a mother, father, or sibling who worked in a stigmatized profession or has faced a situation where an authority figure betrayed them, I hope they find courage in the knowledge that they're not alone. Bullying can cut deep, blackmail can terrify you, and societal judgments can make you feel unworthy. But every scar can be a reminder that you survived, and every new day is a chance to reclaim your story. My mother and I reclaimed ours. A principal tried to tear it from us, to push us back into the darkness of our worst memories. He tried to turn shame into a product we had to pay for, but shame loses its grip when you expose it to the light. We exposed his scheme, faced the consequences, and emerged with our integrity. That's why, at the end of it all, I can say with certainty that our bond is stronger than ever. She is no longer the stripper, and I am no longer the stripper's kid. We're just a mother and daughter who love each other fiercely and know how to fight for ourselves when the world tries to say we don't deserve respect. And if the old videos still exist somewhere on the internet, we refuse to cower. We refuse to apologize for her past or my childhood. She did what she had to do, and I survived what I had to survive. That principal thought he could exploit that, but he learned that a family willing to stand up for the truth is more powerful than any blackmail threat. The shame is his alone to bear, and we've got our lives to live, free from that cloud of fear. That is the story of how bullying followed me for years because of my mother's profession, and how the final blow came in the form of a principal's twisted blackmail scheme. Yet it's also the story of how we took our power back. In the end, we've turned the page on that painful chapter, determined to define ourselves by our strength and hope, rather than someone else's attempt to profit from our vulnerability. When I look at my mother now, I see a woman who worked tirelessly for me, who wouldn't buckle under the weight of shame, and who stood beside me in court as we brought that man to justice. That's who we really are, a family that stands together, undefeated. And that knowledge, more than anything, gives me peace each time I reflect on the journey that once felt impossible to endure.